All right, guys, good evening. It is time for Wednesday night Bible study. We are going to be looking at the book of Hebrews tonight in chapter 11, verses 17 through 22. We're going to finish up with Abraham, go into Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph tonight. It shouldn't take us all that long, so don't get discouraged. Maybe 15 minutes, and I'll hopefully have given you something that you can chew on a little bit. We're talking about the subject of faith, what it is, what it should look like in our lives, what it did look like in the patriarchs' lives, and the options. I know for me, there is the tendency to cut myself too much slack and to depend way too much on myself, my first thought, which is usually not the best thing, instead of taking time to speak to my Father to get His counsel, His wisdom, and then to know that what I've done or what I should do going forward is the appropriate thing. And I've spent, maybe like you, but I've spent most of my life just making knee-jerk decisions. Sometimes I've even spent a lot of time on the decision and still made the wrong decision, because you can spend all the time in the world on thinking on a decision, a choice, whatever that you have, and still get it wrong because you did not consult the one who knows the future, which is God. And at least for me, I have done that so many times in my life that you would think I would have learned better by now, and sometimes I have, but not all the time. And I'm working toward growing toward all the time. Today, I was in a meeting with Miss Sally and Jim, and in that meeting, Miss Sally asked me a question, and I gave her an immediate answer. And then I backed up. The Holy Spirit is good at this with me, thankfully. I backed up and said, you know what, Miss Sally, that's not the best answer. And then I gave her what I felt like was from God, the best answer. And I've asked God for wisdom. I've asked God to mature me. I've asked God to grow me spiritually. And He is and has and will, which I'm thankful for because I believe. And so we're looking at faith tonight, looking at Abraham to begin with, and just made some notes on Abraham and his faithfulness. Abraham was faithful, or had faith in God, when he did not know where he was going, verses 8 through 10. He did not know how he was going to have a child. He was as good as dead, and so was Sarah, verses 11 through 12. He did not know when it was going to happen. In fact, it didn't happen in his lifetime. And tonight, he did not know why God would ask him to do such a thing. And yet, Abraham didn't know where, how, when, or why, but he just trusted God. Now, he didn't trust God perfectly. He had some lessons to learn, as we do. That's called life. But he did learn. And so, looking at verse 17, it was by faith that Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice when God was testing him. So, for those of you that aren't familiar with the Abraham-Isaac story, obviously Isaac is his son. It's not his first son. His first son's name was Ishmael. That is not the son of promise, because that was done by man's power. In other words, man's plan said, go with Hagar and you can have your son. They did indeed have a son. It was Ishmael, but that was not God's way. God told them to trust Him, not make a way for it to happen. And so many times in our life, at least in mine, in ministry and being a pastor, being a minister in general, I just want to go ahead and do it my way, and I'll end up with a lot of Ishmaels. And Ishmael, while not a bad person, was not God's perfect plan, and has been his lineage has been a thorn in Israel's side ever since. I don't want to say it's a thorn in the whole world's side, but it is a thorn in Israel's side, or basically in Isaac's side of the family, because they did not wait for God. But then when God gave it to him, Abraham was 90, I believe Sarah was 80, or maybe Abraham was, I can't remember. They were old. And so it was impossible for them to have a child, impossible for Sarah, improbable for for Abraham, but and yet they did. That child's name was Isaac. And God had made Abraham some promises about his lineage and his legacy, and that he would be the father of many nations, that his descendants would multiply and would be more numerous than the stars in the sky, the sand in the sea. And so Abraham knew that had to come through Isaac. And yet, now God has told Abraham to get up, to take Isaac to a mountain that he'll show him, and to sacrifice him, to kill him. Now, he doesn't give this information to Isaac. He brings Isaac along with some servants along, but he doesn't give this information to Isaac. He just makes this long journey. And as he's making this journey, I know in his mind he had to be thinking, what is God doing? But the scripture here answers the thought process, and I want to show you. Abraham, who had received God's promises, was ready to sacrifice his only son Isaac, even though God told him, Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. That's Genesis 21:12. Abraham reasoned. Now listen to this. This is faith. Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, God was able. And I underlined that. If Isaac died, in other words, if he literally brought the knife down and Abraham took Isaac's life, that God was able. And then in this particular case, to bring him back to life again. God would be able to do that. Now, this is unprecedented in our life when, it doesn't happen in our lives either, but we know of it through the Bible. Abraham did not. And so, to reason that out is pretty incredible. It is impossible for someone to come back to life once they are dead, at least in the physical form, as we know it. And so for Abraham to take his life, to reason that God is able to bring him back to life, is crazy faith. That's just crazy faith. That is impossible faith. And I want to tell you that this isn't like I'm taking my favorite dog, although, Buddy would be hard for me to sacrifice. If God said, Randall, go sacrifice your dog, that would be hard for me to do, but that's not like sacrificing my son. And so to have this kind of faith, Abraham reasoned that God was able. I wonder how many times we don't see the power of God because we don't believe God is able. We want to see it in our midst. We want to see it in our life. We want to see it in our church. But we don't want to believe to the level that God is able to do the impossible. We just want to operate and live in the realm of the possibilities. And I just want to tell you, there's something bigger than the possibility. It's God. And God can do the impossible. And Abraham believed that he was able to do that. It was by faith then. And Abraham... and in a sense, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead. In other words, at just the right time, God stopped Abraham. He did not take his son's life, and God provided a ram for their sacrifice. They went ahead and sacrificed. And so Abraham then taught the rest of his life Isaac. Isaac then passed it on. Isaac had two boys, if you will remember. Jacob and Esau. Now that's not the correct order. It's Esau and Jacob. Esau was the oldest, but Esau hated his birthright so much so that he was willing to sell it for a bowl of stew. And so God had a real problem with Esau's attitude about life in general. He just wanted to hunt and live crazy. Now, not cutting Jacob any slack, because Jacob was a mama's boy and just wanted to stay inside. But I just want to share with you that when you see it in the Bible, it's Jacob and Esau. They were twins, but it was actually Esau and Jacob. But Esau chose not to cherish his birthright, and it was given trickeringly to Jacob. Jacob is then, it says, it was by faith that Isaac promised blessings of future to his sons Jacob and Esau, and both of them were blessed. Both of them became fathers of nations. Edom on Esau's case, and Israel on Jacob's case. God changed Jacob's name to Israel. That's where the country gets its name, is from the man Jacob that God changed to Israel. It was by faith that Jacob, when he was dying, blessed Joseph's son and bowed in worship as he was leaning on a stick. Remember, leaning on a stick remember Jacob had the fight with the angel of the Lord, and he limped for the rest of his life. He learned to worship in spite of his limp. God taught him and is teaching us that no matter how dysfunctional you may come from or how dysfunctional you may have been, God can still use you if you will be used. Jacob had a son that goes on to say, verse 22, it was by faith that Joseph, when he was about to die, said confidently that the people of Israel would leave Egypt. He even commanded them to take his bones with them when they left. 400 years after Joseph went to Egypt, they actually took him back, obviously his bones, back to Israel to be buried. But Joseph was new. And the Joseph in this story is the incredible Joseph to me. The incredible guy by faith. He received visions from God. He shared them, perhaps too pompously, with his brothers who already didn't like him because he was his father's favorite, and then shared another dream where all of them were bowing down to him, and then even his mother and father were bowing down to him, and that didn't go well with the family, especially with his brothers, and so they looked for an opportunity. They were going to kill him. Obviously, they did not. They just sold him into slavery. He was taken down to Egypt, taken away from everything that he knew, his God, his home, his family, everything, and put into this horrible situation where he had to become a slave. Then from slavery, he went to prison, and then from prison, he interpreted dreams. In that dreams, he became Pharaoh's second in command. And then ultimately his brothers came down because of famine. They realized he was Joseph. When he told them he was Joseph, they panicked. Joseph said, listen, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And Joseph never gave up faith. And there was no reason for him to have it except faith. There's no reason in all that story that Joseph would have had reason to look up. If his faith was based on his circumstances, there was no reason for Joseph to look up, and yet he did, all the way through. And when he finally got within his grasp the means to give recompense, to get vengeance, instead of that, he chose to bless. Faith did that. Faith is what caused that. And faith literally saved the children of Israel, the sons of Israel. They came down with their families along with Jacob. And there they stayed in Egypt for 400 years until Moses, as we're going to talk about next week, brings them out. And so crazy story, crazy amazing. Faith can do amazing things. You got to trust even when it doesn't make sense. You got to pass it on to your children, not just by word, but by deed. And not get hung up on, well, I'm imperfect. Well, so was Jacob. But just trust and ask God to grow your faith, our faith, so that God can do those kind of crazy things with us. Looking forward to it. Thank you.